we acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which our meeting is taking place. And so to that end, I would like to acknowledge the Muanina and the Palawa peoples and the contributions of their elders past, present and future. Welcome to this. This is our second of our Q&As. And I am delighted to introduce a colleague and a friend, Dr. Lonce Bailey, who's an associate professor of political science at Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania. Lonce completed his PhD at University of Massachusetts and has done a variety of really cool and interesting things since then. One of them was working as a congressional aide in California as well. I was fortunate enough to meet Lonce on a study in the United States program that is run in coordination with the US State Department, which is this wonderful thing where basically the US State Department pays people like me and from a variety of other countries to go and learn how to teach American politics. This is US soft power at perhaps its best as far as offering. And Lonce was one of the directors of that program, and the program was amazing. Lonce's contribution to it and his driving of it obviously contributed to how amazing it was. And it's always been a pleasure to catch up with Lonce when I've been back in the US, and the ability to talk to him, not as frequently as I'd like. And he was one of the first people I thought of today when I was sorting out this program. So a little bit of housekeeping. Lonce today has been invited to speak about the House races. So keeping in mind, obviously, that there is a pretty important presidential race as well, but there are also, and I love this vernacular in the US, there are down ticket races as well to talk about. So Lonce is going to talk 10-15 minutes, after which we'll have some questions. If you want to ask your questions using the chat function, and I'll moderate them, and then we will be able to direct them to Lonce, and we'll have some to-in and fro-ing, and we'll see how we're traveling at about 11 o'clock, and we'll go from there. So, Lonce, again, thank you so much for joining us. 8 o'clock your time, and it's a real pleasure. So I'll hand it over to you now.
Great. Hey, Matt, thank you for the nice introduction. And having Matt be one of our participants in the summer program was a real treat. That program brought in over 200 people over several years of the program when I ran it. We brought in over 200 people from almost 80 different countries over time, and several from Australia, including Matt. And you don't know this, Matt, but after the program goes away, all the staff talks about our top 10 list of all time. We know who our favorites are from that year, but we say, who are the best participants of all time? And you fall into that list every year that we've discussed it. So it was quite a joy. And someday we're going to steal you from Tasmania and bring you to the US where the action's real. No, it was a great deal. And the soft power thing is exactly right. And I was always skeptical of it until I started working in it. And I think it does do what we would like it to do. So much so that the Trump administration decided to cancel the programs. But the deep state is still there, and I think they're hoping to revive these in some future date. So, but the coronavirus put the nail in the coffin for this year, but it was quite a battle. But thank you for having me, and I'm really looking forward to everybody's questions. And I do follow these races and all the things that go with it. But I always know there's a lot of people out there that follow at least parts of it much closer than I do even. So I'm hoping to learn something from you all as well, from where I'm going to, in addition to what I'm going to offer. And I'm going to talk about the House and Senate races, then I'll talk a little bit about the presidential races and a couple other just sort of interesting statistics that are sort of driving part of what's going on. It is a very interesting year indeed along the way. And I'll probably do the House and Senate together. I might bounce back and forth because there's stuff that goes with it. I'm assuming everybody knows sort of the basic structure. The Senate is 100 members and the House is 435. In the Senate, only a third of the people get elected each year. It's on a cycle, so that only a third is up for re-election in any given year. So we've got 33 races out there roughly. And then the House is up for re-election every 2 years. So the entire House. So the entire House is up for re-election and a third of the Senate as we think through it. The House clearly seems, in terms of predicting what's going to happen, seems to be clearly going to be a Democratic-controlled House again. There's nobody predicting a Republican-controlled House, or nobody that has their wits about them that would be able to do it. There's a chance that the Democrats in the House will pick up a few additional seats. And the reason why they wouldn't pick up more is that in the previous election 2 years ago, they had what we would call a blue wave, blue meaning Democrat, of course. And so they picked up a lot of seats, and they sort of picked up all what we call low-hanging fruit, all the easy seats to into their hands. And so anything that's left over for this election is either going to be a battle over those seats, or they're going to be picking up seats that are much harder to get. But I would expect to see a handful of additional seats. And we'll talk a little bit more about what makes the House race interesting. But this is a general first step. I wanted to put that out there. The Senate is a much bigger deal for a couple reasons. One is it's much, much tighter. The margins are very narrow. It is currently, of course, controlled by the Republicans by about a 3-seat advantage. And the consequences of a Senate winning going to another party are large too, because the Senate controls a lot of presidential action through the confirmation process around judges and other appointments, not to mention investigations. The Senate just has, it doesn't necessarily have more power than the House, but in certain key areas, it's a very strategic piece to have. So the Senate, on that side, the split there is 47-53. And that 47 Democrats include 2 independents that caucus with the Democrats, Bernie Sanders, who most of you probably have heard of, and another guy named Angus King, which sounds very British, but he's also from New England. And they safely caucus with the Democrats. And so for the Democrats to win control of the Senate, at minimum, they would need 3 seats, which would make it a 50-50 tie. And they would have to win the presidency because the vice president is, oh, thank you for popping it up. I was wondering if I should have slides. I wasn't sure how nimble we were going to be. This is great. But at a 50-50 tie, the vice president casts all tie-breaking votes, and if Biden wins, his vice president, which is another fun thing to talk about, although not that relevant, but sort of fun, that would give the Democrats control. As it stands now, I would say that the best polling out there is showing that Dems are going to pick up 5 seats in the Senate. And as of now, of course, we still got, 80 days left for the election. And if they're saying that, that's sort of a big deal. So, and they're predicting, I think it's Florida to go their way. Well, I'm going to tell you what it is. So the breakdown on the states for those, everything is by states. One thing I should reiterate, again, I'm guessing there's a variety of level of understanding in the audience, but elections in the United States are not done by the federal government. The federal government conducts no elections. They count no ballots. They print no ballots. All elections are state-centered activities. And this could be a strength in terms of sort of diffusing power. And certainly with a more authoritarian president like President Trump, it's a relief to a degree. But when you decentralize it, you can also get unevenness amongst the states as well. And so so focusing on the states is really what to focus on. And of course, we have a lot of them. The states that are likely to flip, almost certain, I think, would be Colorado and Arizona, which are the ones there that are kind of shaded red right now. And Arizona has a gentleman by the name of Mark Kelly, who's a decorated astronaut, but he was also the husband to a member of Congress on the House side who was shot by an attempted murder plot, not a plot, but by someone who one of our crazy gun shootings, which, we could have that conversation too. And she was disabled enough that she had to resign her seat. She's still alive, but her her skills are still pretty formidable, but to work as a member of Congress was difficult. So he's running for that seat and is likely to win, to beat the incumbent Republican who has held the seat for a couple years because she was appointed. That would mean both Arizona senators are Democrats. Kristen Sinema, who was elected last time around, and then Mark Kelly. And then the other big one would be Colorado, where the former governor, John Hickenlooper, is set to beat the incumbent Booker there. And Hickenlooper, in addition to having a complicated name, had a bumpy primary, but came out of it okay and seems to be doing okay now. And there's, as you can imagine, truckloads of money being spent on those elections. And it looks like Arizona and Colorado will go Democrat. Again, we can't predict it. It's 80 days away, but that's what it's trending. The other ones, I'm going to say them in sort of what I would call rank order of likelihood to flip. And I would say Maine and North Carolina. We're going to see shifts there. And then the Iowa one looks a little closer than a lot of people say to me, but Montana, Iowa, and at least one seat in Georgia because of a vacancy in Georgia. They actually have 2 Senate seats running at the same time, which is it's very rare. It's to complete out a partial term. Again, because states get to decide sort of how that works. So I would say Colorado and Arizona for sure, Maine and North Carolina likely. That gets you 4, which means the Dems have the majority. But the Montana, Iowa, and Georgia also right now are all trending towards electing Democrats. And then there are longer shots. It's Kansas, Texas, South Carolina, and Kentucky. I think I mentioned Florida. I meant that in the presidential term. Sorry about that. Florida, obviously not a case right now. Kansas, Texas, South Carolina, and Kentucky are long. I'm going to tell you this. If the Dems pick up seats in those states, the presidential election's over. Right? It's just Texas, I think, is a chance. Kansas, right now, polling-wise, Kansas is looking Dem, but those are very fresh polls. Kansas just had their primary, and they had sort of a really, I'm just going to say it this way. I can't think of a more eloquent way to say it, but a really crazy Trump guy, a guy named Chris Kobach, who was just basically a conspiracy theorist guy, but huge with Trump. And he lost the primary to the more mainstream Republican, who also supports Trump, but it's sort of normal. If Chris Kobach had won, I think the Democrats could have won Kansas. But the crazy guy didn't win, so they're running against the mainstream guy. And so I think that will trend. Texas, well, you're guessing at this point. Texas, South Carolina, Kentucky. Kentucky is Mitch McConnell's seat, and the Dems are, of course, drooling over that, but I don't think that's probably a reality. And again, if any of those seats go, it's likely to go. And that's just something to point out, is that states that the president wins in an election where there's also a Senate election, the Senate, in close races, the Senate tends to go to the winner of the presidential election. So if Biden picks up, let's pick one here, what would he pick up? Georgia, a little tough sell, but let's say Georgia, it's likely that they would also win the Senate race there. And that makes sense because most people don't split their ticket that much. If they're voting for Biden, they're going to vote for the Democrats. So a lot of it has to do just with turnout, okay? So on the Senate side, you're looking for 3 seats. So if you're examining it and tracking it and keeping trace of it, they need 3, really 4 or 5 seats. That gets them a majority. We still have parts of what's called a supermajority, a filibuster-proof majority. We can get into that later if you want. We're not going to. The Democrats are not going to reach that. I've seen people model it to see if it could happen, but it's really not going to happen. On the House side, it's a 232 to 198 split. I wouldn't be surprised if the House picked up another 5 seats. It depends, but they're certainly not going to lose any seats. They'll go up by a couple at least. And one of the things to remember in all these races is that in the United States now too, we have a much larger. It's been happening over several years. Much larger early voting, where you can mail in your ballot, or go to the. It's usually done by the county, but go to the county elections office, and so in several states, voting will start in September, so in a few weeks. And so it won't matter what happens between September and November if millions of people have voted before November even happened. And we can talk, I'm going to talk about that more a little bit here in a second. The thing to pay attention to the House, I think that's more interesting, or I don't know if it's more interesting, but it kind of is something sort of newly developing, and we've seen it on the Republican side a little bit. And that's this sort of a little bit of, I'm not going to say warfare, but clashing between the progressive left of the Democratic Party and what we might just call the mainstream Democratic Party. If you're a progressive, you call them neoliberals or Republicans or something. But anyway, there is this sort of progressive inroads being made on state level races and then House races and even Senate races to some deals. So even though Bernie Sanders, who is sort of the love child of the progressives, didn't win his nomination, in fact, he got pounded by Biden. That election was impressive to begin with. But they're making real inroads. And so we really see a pretty hard-fought battle of progressive candidates taking out long-standing members of the House of Representatives who were pretty liberal to begin with. I mean, they weren't, they were not the types that were like, they were powerful and they were there for a long time and they had mixed around with interest groups and PACs and stuff, but it wasn't like they were, cutting deals on gun legislation or something. A few of these have been big. The most recent one, if you've been paying attention, is Cori Bush, who in Missouri, never run for office before. She was a nurse. She might have been a preacher at one point or something. And she ran against a 10-term, either 10-year or 10, I guess it was a 10-year incumbent who was a black Democrat who had the seat. Before him, his father had the seat for a couple decades. So this had been in the family's name for 30, 40 years. She's African-American. He's African-American. She ran against him and beat him. He was powerful. He had serious committee assignments. He was a senior member of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is a very powerful caucus in Congress. And she won. She beat him. She's got to win in the general election, which I think is going to be the case. And then some other ones. One you might know, Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, who is part of that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and I'm forgetting the third one. But anyway, this PAC, she had a tough. There was worries that she was going to have a tough primary, but she sort of easily won out of Michigan. And then there's several others. There's two in New York. Jamal, his name I can't remember. Jamal Bowman, something like that, out of New York. There's a candidate, last name of Jones, I think, out of New York as well, out of Westchester area. And then another candidate out of Illinois, all who are either upset or won the primary to be the more progressive candidate. One of the more interesting ones, and I'm bringing this up because you might have met this guy actually, Matt. There's a very powerful member of Congress in Western Massachusetts, where the University of Massachusetts is, where Matt was hanging out, a guy named Richie Neal, who you did not meet. And he is chairman of, I forget, I don't know, Ways and Means or something. He's big. He's a big chairperson of these pieces. And he's facing a very tight progressive left incumbent by the name of Adam Morse, who's the mayor of Holyoke, Massachusetts. And some years we went to go visit him. Did you meet him? Adam Morse, young guy, gay, red hair.
Name rings a bell, Lonce. Yeah.
Yeah, you might have met. I mean, it's been several years. Super young. I mean, he won the mayorship in a town that is half Puerto Rican. It's the highest concentration of Puerto Rican citizens in the entire country in his city. The other half is sort of retired post-industrial Irish Catholic guys. You can imagine what that's like. And this 24-year-old kid coming out of college, he might have been 23 or something, won the mayor's race there and has been a very good mayor. And he is challenging Richie Neal. There's been no polling out of there. But, I mean, and this is just, I shouldn't dwell on this, but to show how big this is, no one's paying attention to this race outside of people like me, right? No, there's no news reporting, whatever. And there's a big scandal that came out that Adam Morse was having romantic affairs with students at the UMass campus, where he was doing some guest lecturing, and it's made national news all of a sudden overnight, because it's this progressive left standard Democrat battle. And the piece reads like a hit piece. There is no doubt in my mind, I have no proof, that Richie Neal, at least his allies, set this up to take this guy down. It was just a classic. When you read through all the details, you're like, oh man, this guy got munched in this piece. it just shows you the stakes of the game, I guess, is what I want to point out. And the fact that a race that would get no attention now has articles in the Washington Post, major columnists across the country have commented on it. It's fascinating within that. Okay, I know I'm rambling, so I'm going to get going here. A couple things to think about along the way. And on a bigger scale, I'll give you an idea. In the last, there's several reports that do these kinds of things. They're all sort of similar. There were 29 new shifts in elections, meaning it changed. It went from strong Republican to lean Republican, or lean Republican to a toss-up. Or you get the idea. There's 29 shifts that happened, I think it was 5 days ago. 27 of those shifts shifted towards the Democrats. It doesn't mean they're going to win those seats, but 27 of the shifts were some way positive towards Democrats out of that. And that was reported in different combinations of ways in several sources out of there as well. So that's give you a general feeling of where the push is. And I think what you're going to see, too, is as Trump weakens, although there's not much time left, they have to buy commercial time in advance, but as Trump weakens, we've already seen reporting out of this, the big mega donors to Trump are starting to withhold money and spend it on Senate and House races, or even state-level races, which I'll talk about in a quick second. So in general, you might see a lot more influx of cash, which might shift some of these things around. But again, if you haven't had the shift by the middle of October, we're talking millions of ballots are going to have been sent in by this point. And so whatever happens between October and the election day doesn't matter. You can run all the commercials you want. If you've cast your ballot, you cast your ballot. Okay, real quick on Trump. Polls are terrible for Trump right now. There's just no two ways about it. It's not even debatable. It looks like he will, the trifecta states that got him the presidency in the first place, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, are all trending Biden by at least, no one's double digits, but deep single digits. And if Biden wins, though, the election's over. That's what won it for Trump. But also, we are now seeing, as I mentioned earlier mistakenly, is that Florida is now looking pro-Biden right at this particular point, not to mention other states. If Florida and Arizona go Biden, it doesn't matter what else happens, the race is over. So if you want to pay attention to a couple close races, Florida, Arizona, presidential, definitely pay attention. He's losing in everything, especially amongst educational attainment. So voters with a college education, even bigger for Biden than for Clinton. He's losing in significant numbers with white suburban moms, white educated males, huge gender gap. Check this out. Clinton had a plus 13 advantage in the gender gap. Right now, Biden has a plus 21 in the gender gap. And more women vote in the United States than men. So the gender gap's big. He's lost ground in every group, even groups he's still leading in, he's still lost ground on them. One of the big ones is older voters. Trump was plus 7 in 2016, and now he's losing by, I think, 4 points to Biden in older voters. Arizona and Florida, big retiree states. If he's losing older voters and white voters, they're going to come out of that state there. So real big to do it. A couple other, I'm almost done. A couple other big I guess I've talked a little longer than I thought. Okay. Couple of interesting numbers that we'd like to pay attention to. Country out of control, polling, national polling. Country is out of control. 80% of Americans think the country's out of control. 92% of Democrats, catch this, 66, I think it is, 66% of Republicans. Crazy. Country on the wrong track, which is one of my favorite pollings. 72% of the country thinks the country on the track. Well, I mean, that's not a shocker. We're like the worst country in the world for handling the coronavirus. Like the most capable of doing it, and we did the worst job, I think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong on that assessment, but 59, the other things, these are tough too. 59% of Americans not confident in the honesty of the elections. That's partially Trump's doing, partially vote by mail, partially this COVID thing. And then, of course, we're going to have a VP pick here in the next few days. And so within a week, and we could speculate with that if you want to. Here are 5 big states coming up for the pick. They're all leaning Biden right now, either strong Biden or very close, like within 3 points. Arizona, Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, and Georgia. Those are all big swing states, all leaning Biden at this particular point. We still got a couple months to go. But if today everybody voted who wanted to vote, so nothing else going wrong, Biden would win easily, no doubt about it. But we have several things going on. Voter suppression. We're seeing, remember, elections are run by not just states, but counties. We're seeing voter lists purged. Just people who thought they were registered to vote, they show up and they're not registered to vote. We have very complicated voting systems, as you know. There's fewer polling places, especially we're seeing in like black communities or communities with minority audiences. Ads to try to stop people from voting, including external ads from places like Russia and China and whatnot. Election administration, we're not quite sure about because we have the biggest mail-in voting we've ever seen, including several states who have never done mail-in voting before. And this gets really complicated. Mail-in ballots also have a lot of errors. Ballots in general, across the board, I've not seen the international studies, but in the U.S., have a lot of voting error, a lot more than you would actually think. And there's great studies I can refer you to if you're interested in that along the way. And then the last thing to be sure to pay attention, it's very obscure. Well, one thing, I think our elections, we're not going to know, there's a chance we're not going to know the results for a few days. Certainly not in the House and the Senate, maybe the presidency if it's a wipeout. But the other thing too is very obscure, but the state legislatures control the redistricting of congressional boundaries. And that's based on the new census, and we have a census we're doing now. And so to control a state legislature is a really, really big deal. And the Republicans know that, and they're really good at it. And so if you see gains in flipping state legislatures, that would be big news. All right, that's it. Too much.
No, not too much at all. And there's so much to engage with there. So there's not too many questions, but I'm so glad that you spoke about the census, because I mean, just when we think 2020 is huge in lots of ways, the fact that there's also a census, and the census is being criticised at the moment as well because of obviously the, problems to do with the pandemic and people being able to respond or not respond, making the census, shortening the period of the census, which means that I guess those people who most need to be counted aren't being counted, especially when it comes to sort of prioritising funding and redistricting and those sort of things. So just when you think that 2020 is big, the fact that it's also a census year just makes it absolutely huge. You're exactly right.
Yeah, so, it's a big deal. I mean, I don't know the numbers on the state. The state numbers are tough to find, but the Republicans are pros at controlling state legislatures. They make the Democrats look like fools. And that's why you would have a much bigger House of Representative Democratic vote right now if you had more state Democratic control of state legislatures. Not all states do it through the legislatures, but most of them do. Anyway, go ahead.
So, because we're talking sort of about electoral politics more broadly, and for example, you mentioned a few states, Senate races, where you might sort of otherwise have expected safe Republican wins, especially in those southern states. And I guess Susan Collins, you spoke about in Maine as well. At what point do you think there will be an effort to distance themselves from the president in some of these races?
This is an excellent question. And so the word on the street, which I'm sure you've all read, and I've just seen it through the newspapers. I don't have any special, insight on this particular piece. Is that senators, at least under McConnell's direction, have been given the green light to go ahead and distance themselves as they need and see fit. Not that was a blessing from Trump. Trump doesn't think strategically like that. And I don't mean that as a derogatory thing. Trump thinks differently about this stuff. I have a lot of criticism of Trump, so I can think of but it's easy to say he's just a dummy. I don't think he's a dummy. He thinks of this as his, not cartel, but he thinks of this as his, family business. This is Vito Corleone. Vito Corleone doesn't ever let a capo go do what they want to do, right? You've either been endorsed to go do it or you don't. And if you do it without my endorsement, I chop your legs off, right? And Trump thinks in those terms. And so the direction has to come from McConnell on this piece. And the sense was that they've all been released to do what they need to do. I saw another, again, an op-ed piece that was citing various sources, and nothing I double-checked, but that was sort of suggesting that members have decided to try to just sort of sink or swim with Trump as much as they can. I think I think in Colorado, Arizona, and Maine, my guess is, from my understanding of it, is that they certainly are not using his coattails. And I would say that in general, the races that are tight, the ones I rattled off to you, they would not use Trump as a way to get reelected, but they will not necessarily disavow them. So they're looking for a strategy in which they don't have to answer for Trump's problems, so to speak, or his failures, and but at the same time, they can hopefully still get the Trump vote that will pick up. There goes one of my daughters right there. Anyway, but there's not a wholesale release on it. And this is true of our party policy. This is one of the differences. Our parties are strong within the body, that is deciding leadership and committees and how legislation flows. It's strong as a label for citizens, but we don't go do party things. No one joins a party. No one sends a check. This is true in a lot of modern democracies. But in the election side of it, in general, leadership wants to maintain seats. And if maintaining seats means I don't talk about the president, or I even criticize the president a little bit, then I'll do it. But Trump's coattails are short, no doubt about it. I would say in Kansas, the southern states, they have to go both ways. I mean, they have to be able to say, I love Trump, and at the same time separate themselves a little bit along the way. I don't think you'll see Trump, the coronavirus takes us away too, but I don't think you'll see Trump campaigning on behalf of these people or doing robocalls for as many as we see. But the ability to be so strategic with campaign material, though, too, right? So you got a good list of phone numbers. This is not like in the 1980s when I had a good list of phone numbers or 1990s, I should say, for a candidate. These things are really precision. They pay top dollar for this info. And so when you're sending a robocall from Trump to this list, that's all positive. There's nobody turned off by it. And all these other people don't even know the robocall happened, right? So I think you'll see a lot of that as well.
So we've got a couple of questions, Lonce, and I'd love to dominate, but that's not what this is set up for. So
Sure.
Mark is asking about, and I'm fascinated in this as well. So I guess the Lincoln Project is the most high-profile one of people who identify as Republicans running actively against President Trump. How damaging is that with respects to getting Republicans elected?
It's a hell of a lot of fun, at least. I can tell you that much. Those Lincoln Project commercials are good, man. I was like, How come the Democrats can never do those things, man? The Republicans really know their stuff. And I listened to one of the main guys on that, what's his name? I follow his stuff. I listened to his podcast, which is really good. Oh, God, all of a sudden.
Not George Conway, the other one, the other guy.
No, the other one. Shoot, I get his tweets all the time. Anyway, so the question is, does it have an impact? And so I would say the popular reasoning would be like, not really. What they're doing is what is known now as swift voting, which for those who don't know was a small PAC that ran their own ads against John Kerry, who was a decorated Vietnam veteran who had commanded a swift boat, which are these river boats that would go and shoot the Viet Cong from river boats. And these were people that had served under him that ran commercials saying he was not what everybody thinks he was. He was a terrible leader, and he didn't do what he said, and he's a fraud. Really damaged Kerry a lot. So it's not that these things can't, and it's not that the Lincoln Project won't, but in terms of, I think, having a defining impact on the race, I think it doesn't feel that way per se. I will say this. I do think what it does is provide a place for Republicans to go and be respectable and oppose Trump. So if I'm a local businessman and I'm a Republican and I belong to the local business clubs and I do my thing and I'm a lifelong Republican, and in my groups I can't go around and say I hate Trump and I'm thinking of voting for Biden. I'm going to get eviscerated, right, by all my friends, and they're going to tell me I'm a commie and all this stuff. But now this growing group of Republicans who have legitimate Republican credentials, and they've existed the entire time, not just George Will and these people, but Mitt Romney, for instance, right? And then the Lincoln Project, another group, I can't remember what it's called. Now all of a sudden, you can say, look, I'm a lifelong Republican, and I agree with these other Republicans, and there's this place you can exist and still be respectful, and you can defend yourself. I do think it creates a space for people who want to speak out about their Republican viewpoint and still be critical of Trump at the end of the day. I think it really gets under the skin of Trump from all the reports and the cajillion leaks coming out of the White House. The leaks out of the White House are at an all-time high in the last few weeks. And apparently they run these ads on Fox News at night, basically, when Trump's watching. This is what they did. Their very first ad they ran cost them, I think it was $7,000. They ran it on Fox News at 10 o'clock at night. The president tweeted about it, and they got, I think it was 50 million views of the commercial the next day. For $7,000, I could write a $7,000 check and get 50 million views. I'm rich, frankly. But anyway, so will I have a really will it shave the points? Yeah, I mean, I think on the edges, it's not bad. They're really good at what they do. So there's a bunch of these groups that exist, but this group is really good at what they do in terms of using new media or using social media and where they place their ads and the nature of their ads, and they become addictive. They just get sent around. I mean, the problem is, lots of Democrats send it around to lots of other Democrats. They're not going to vote for Trump anyway.
Yeah.
But it does provide a world there that they can do it. That's a long answer. I should have been quick.
No, that's a good answer. And Zach's got a really good question as well, and then you raised this, and especially with mail-in ballots, and what seems to be a crisis with the U.S. Postal Service at the moment. How's that playing out, and is there any sense of sort of public frustration?
Yeah. So at one level, there is no crisis at the Postal Service. We have basically one of the few things we're good at is getting mail out. We have one of the best postal services in the world. In fact, you could easily probably say we have the best. We're not the best at anything else anymore, but except for spending a lot of money in the military, but we are good at that. And so at one level, there is no crisis. The crisis is a made-up crisis that Trump has brought to the Post Service. It was made up initially, but now is the reporting on it is not definitive. But there's sense that they're trying to slow mail down. But again, these are just sort of things you hear, and that they put in a new Postmaster General, and the Postmaster General apparently has had a midnight massacre, they called it, of course, where they got rid of lots of high-level people. And this is a complex organization, as you know, mailing billions of pieces of mail a year to little tiny addresses for 50 cents. It's like, it's complex. And so there is concern and worry. And when I gave you that number about people worried about the election, that's a big part of it. Whether it's justified or not, it doesn't really matter. Trump has created this uncertainty around mailing that didn't exist. There was no problem with our voting by mail, ever. We have several states that have done it for many years. All our military personnel overseas have voted by mail for decades. We've never had a problem. This stuff has been studied to death. But, in this case, he wants to undermine it. It's interesting, though. You know who's utilized vote by mail the best is the Republicans. This was their deal. They voted by the mail in droves, and they coordinated it. They did the whole bit. And so it's weird. There's this weird thing that people have written about where he's sort of undermining a tool the Republicans wanted to have and sort of scaring them into voting in person, which might get lower rate. Because what if it rains on Election Day? Or, what if there's a hurricane in Georgia? And so Georgia's a close state. And I will tell you, just from a person, just my gut feeling, I'm worried about it. Do I think the Postal Service is going to hold up a bunch of stuff? No. Mail-in ballots tricky, too, because most states don't open those until the day after the election. And so, but we have a lot more coming in. So they could be having to count mail-in ballots by the millions. I heard a great interview with a woman who does a big online, I forget the name of the group. She's been pushing. She wishes that it was all done by mail, that it's more secure, it's easier, it's hard copy, right? It says no hacking anything. And she even now, though, she's just like, you should vote by mail. You should vote by mail. I'm going to vote in person. I live in an area where I'm not going to have any lines. It's easy to vote. I just don't trust anything. I want to be there to vote. I live in a state where Trump won by the biggest margin of any state in the country. I live in West Virginia. I work in Pennsylvania, but I live in West Virginia. So my vote doesn't really matter. I'm not voting for Trump, not to divulge my preferences, but yeah, I would pay attention to it. What I'm really worried about is just it undermining overall sense of security of the elections.
It's not just elections, I think, Lonce. I mean, in some ways, this is the worst case scenario, isn't it? Perhaps, I don't know, for example, Arizona's close, Georgia's close. They're still counting ballots on mail-in, and it feeds into that distrust that the president has been able to foment with respects to these really strong institutions, such as voting, the US Postal Service. And so it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the U.S. has and this might be true of all Western states. I've not seen comparative, but at least in the U.S., we've neglected our public administration for decades now, starting sort of with Reagan and his government is the problem famous speech. And we're starting to see that. And then you add Trump, who gets elected on this idea of the deep state, that the bureaucracy is there to subvert him. And all of a sudden, what were really sophisticated, well-run, admirable public administration units are losing people and can't recruit. And when you don't have enough people to run an operation, you can't run it. The COVID response is a great case in point. Part of this is not just complete lack of leadership. Part of it is just complete neglect of the system and undermining of the system so that the things we usually would have in place could work at the time. And the post office, this is the one that breaks my heart. And there's everybody always complains about the post office. It's what you're supposed to do. That crazy person at the post office who is mean to you or whatever. But the fact is, for 50 cents, I can mail a letter from this beach community to my nephew in Los Angeles. It'll get there in 3 days for 50 cents. About a 99.5% accuracy. Like, I could mail 100 letters and 99 to 100 of them would show up.
Yeah.
But well, why not? Why not take a pot shot at one of our great administrative pieces?
There is method in the madness, isn't there?
Yeah. Yeah. But this is the deal. The Democrats, or in my opinion, the country should hope it's a decisive election. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter if there was questionable stuff in New Mexico or some other place. If it's a total knockout, then no one debate. This is the advantage of the Electoral College, to the extent one exists, is that it sort of quells all the little marginal issues that you might have. If it was a plebiscite and we all voted together and there's one count, then 10,000 in a close election, 10,000 or 100,000 votes here or there might matter. In an Electoral College, when it's a decisive win, it doesn't matter. He has 350 electors won. It doesn't matter if New Mexico was weird or even if Texas was weird, maybe, although it has a lot of electors. So that's the thing about it, is that, and there's a lot of talk about this, but again, talk amongst my people, not amongst the masses, that a decisive election is really crucial on this particular case.
So before I ask Rich's question about possibilities with what the Republican Party does, if you were looking at the map, Lonce, and you had the year of the Biden campaign, and you were seeing these numbers in Georgia, in Arizona, in South Carolina, in Florida, would you move away from the strategy that they've got, which is a pretty narrow strategy of basically just winning back Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania? Or would you start sort of looking and thinking, if I put money in there, then we've got a Senate? Because, I mean, a Biden victory is pretty empty without them winning the Senate as well, isn't it? In lots of ways. I mean, I know we're dealing in hypotheticals here.
Yeah.
What would be your strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I would be, if I was Biden, and I suspect they're doing something like this, even if we don't know it, they're shooting at a good 10, 12 states where they're pouring as much money as they can possibly imagine. So certainly the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, but the Florida, Arizona, where else were we thinking?
You and I still gasp at the fact that Georgia's in play, which is just quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. And North Carolina, they're spending a boatload of money. There's no doubt. And Yeah, those are the ones. Georgia, North Carolina. Yeah, the Georgia thing is amazing. But the Georgia is one of the places where there's some of the worst voter suppression, too.
Yeah.
And playing, I mean, Stacey Abrams should have won that election. And the person who won it through fraud was through his own fraud. Right?
Yeah.
He was in charge of the
As the
election.
Secretary of State,
Like,
yeah.
Drives me crazy. Anyway, there's also a strategy, too, that you can go to states that are pretty close that you might even think, it's a long shot because it forces the other team to spend money. So Texas, for instance.
Yeah.
So you can see where I'm sure they're spending money in Texas, but you can see where they might make a strategic decision to drop, just boatloads of money in Texas as a way to force the Trump campaign to pay attention to it. Now, that being said, neither campaign is really going to have a money issue. If you go back, 12 years, that kind of strategy made a difference in budgeting. Nowadays, they're not really going to have that problem. Not to mention the fact that there's outside groups that can spend the money. So, and they can't coordinate with those groups, but they can signal them, no doubt about it.
Sorry, Lonce, just to be clear, is this since Citizens United that you're talking about, the Supreme Court decision that allows super PACs and large amounts of soft money?
Yeah, so we always have had not always, but for many decades, no, I have to think through the timing of at least till the 70s, groups have had the ability to independently spend money. But Citizens United sort of took the lid off of that by freeing up a number of different mechanisms in which to donate large amounts of money, and if you want to, donate large amounts of money without reporting who's spending it.
Sorry, for people who don't know, this is a Supreme Court decision, Citizens United used versus the Federal Election Commission, that was really, really important with respects to campaign finance.
Huge deal. So the amount of spending outside of what we call the party or the campaign itself, we have candidates in our campaign, so they have their own money. But once you have the nomination, you also secure all the money that the national committee has raised. So well over $1 billion per campaign. And maybe, I don't even know what the numbers are anymore. Are they $2 billion now? I should have looked before I came. I didn't think about the finance. But money's not going to be, I'm not saying they can spend whatever they want. They have to make decisions. But I would expect that Obama did a similar one. If we are where we are now? Middle of August, not quite. If we are where we are in the middle to end of September, I think you'll see Biden start spending in more states as a way to just try to overwhelm the Trump campaign, really put it out of reach. I remember Obama dumped money into West Virginia his first election because he was kind of close at one point. Amazing to me. But anyway, and there have been campaigns that have tried to adopt a 50-state strategy, like we're going to fight for every state as a way to sort of do it. I don't see that happening as much. It can be so strategic. And then the outside groups know what they're doing too. They're very, very good at it. And you're going to see hundreds of millions and billions, frankly, collectively spent on that. Trump actually just recently insulted one of his biggest donors, who's a casino magnate in Nevada, Adelson. He gave Adelson's wife the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her volunteer work. Oh, my God, what a crock. Anyway, and he sort of...
Rush Limbaugh's got one of those too now, huh?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks for turning up the value of the great medal. But anyway, Adelson, who's, a multi-billionaire, like a legitimate, like, worth $50 billion kind of guy, and has written checks for $100 million at a time. Trump kind of pissed him off in a fundraising phone call. Yeah. And so Adelson is screw it. The guy's 90 or something like that. And I think he was just like, screw him. He'll go spend it somewhere else. That's where you get a guy like that. Then all of a sudden he'll spend it on Senate races, right? And forget Trump. So
half an hour at a time. Sorry, Lonce. We've got one more question that I did want to ask you. It's from Rich. And he wants to sort of know hypothetically, what do the Republican Party do with respects to, again, hypothetically, if Trump loses this in 2020, what happens to the Republican Party? Do they go back to being more the party of, in fact, I don't even know how far back we have to go. Do they go back to being more the party of Mitt Romney? I won't say John McCain because he had a degree of sort of being a maverick even within the party, but do they sort of go back to being a traditional conservative party, fiscally conservative, socially conservative? What happens to them?
Yeah, Rich, great question. And I can tell it's winter there because Rich is all bundled up. Merry Christmas to you all. This is an excellent question, and actually it's a question myself and several colleagues of mine have been talking about a lot, because I don't think it can go back to that. Like, I don't know if we're going to see a party realignment. Some have sort of called it the death of the Republican Party. I don't think you're going to see it die, but maybe it has to re-blossom as something else. Our two-party system is such that it'd be hard for it to truly die and some new party to emerge. It doesn't really feed itself to that. But there is a problem. Let's call it 30%. So Trump has really never been below 40%. He's never been above 50, but he's been in this 40 to 50% approval rating. And so you could really say 30 to 35% of they're just hardcore Trumpers. They're fine with all the racial stuff. They're fine with all the grifting. They're fine with all of that. And they're not going to go anywhere, and they're not going to have any place to go, as Richard's probably thinking himself, like, where do they go? They're not going to all of a sudden be voting for Mitt Romney, right? They're not going to all of a sudden be voting for these sort of moderate guys that are sort of almost technocrats, right? They're sort of pro-business policy guys at some level. And so the question is, where do they go? And if we had a multi-party system, that would be an easier answer, but we don't. And we don't have a really way to launch a third party right out of an election. So I don't really have a good answer for you. But I will say, I agree. I think it's a big, big deal. And maybe even a big problem along the way. Because now nobody can do what Trump does. Right? There's no other Republicans are doing the stuff that Trump does. They would get pounded in a second. He just is able to do it, and people attach to it. And there is no follow-up to that. Yeah, it could. Look, I think there's some weird things that could happen. Trump could launch a news network or become the owner of the OANN or whatever it's called, network, which is this very right-wing network. And maybe his sons would run for office or some kind of weird, he would have a Trump party basically, and the Republican Party would be permanently split. And that's a lot of speculation. Another thing that could come out of this, if it was a decisive Biden victory, and a lot of people are already calling for it, is what we would call a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which would process all the corruption and grift that's been going on and really sort of settle what took place and indict people, send people to jail, because there is a ton of documented, that just isn't a ton of documented malfeasance and ethical problems and a variety of things. And so the question is, if that gains steam and people want to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that might be a whole nother deal for the Trumpers, and they may just be sort of beaten down. Look, if I was Biden, the first thing I think I would, well, I don't know. This is what I would do. But if I was Biden, the first thing I would do, because it pisses me off, and it would also help break this up, is I would make it unpalatable for sort of the white nationalist, racist wings of that party, which are out in full force nowadays, walking around with guns and having parties and rallies and the whole bit. I would drive them back underground. I would take the IRS and send them after them. I'd take the FBI. I would take narcotics. I would just make their lives so miserable they would not. This is what we used to do. We made their lives miserable all the time. They couldn't do anything, right? And that's the way it should be, in my opinion, and in the opinion of about 80% of the country, right, at some level. And so if that gets sort of driven, we might just see that whole Trump thing sort of peter out. The Republicans have to come up with something new. The problem is the Republicans have spent the last 30 years, well, let's say 20 years, winning elections and not doing policy. This has been well documented as well. The Republicans are not that interested in policy anymore. They're interested in winning elections, and they're good at it. They shouldn't have as much control as they do, population-wise and election-wise. And so what do you do? How do you rebirth yourself as an election machine if you got a drubbing out of this and you're left with this carcass of a Trump, whatever that might be? It's going to be really problematic. Rich, you're right on the money on that. I don't really have a good answer. We sit around and speculate about it. So hopefully you do too.
I've got half an eye on the time, and I know that I've got to go to another one at 11. I'm sorry, I'm a semi-schedule. So, Lonce, I can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Oh, no problem. Yeah.
Your insights, and I might, if you don't mind, I might tap you maybe to do another one in some time. Yeah. I know there was a media question there, and Lonce, you'll be happy to know that your colleague Ali Dagnas is going to come and talk to us in a few weeks about the media and the election.
She knows her stuff cold. Some of this stuff I stole from her.
Yeah. Nice.
She knows it well. I follow it cold. I do a lot of sharing of information with another guy in California who I really like his thoughts on. But yeah, you're going to love Ali.
Beautiful. Next fortnight, we've got a colleague of mine from the University of Sydney, the American Studies Centre, Brendan O'Connor, and he's going to talk about US foreign policy. So I look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. I'll post for the usual things. Please join me in thanking Lonce, because that was brilliant.
Thank you.
And I look forward to catching up with you soon as well, Lonce. I look forward to seeing you all soon as well. So take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Matt.